This is a story of tragic oversight. The rich, textured culture of Japan flourished beyond American view. Americans made little effort to understand the Japanese desire for industrial expansion from tiny and overcrowded islands. Many Americans perceived the Japanese as second-class human beings and ridiculed their belief in a divine emperor. We did not agree with them that European imperialists should be driven from Asia and that only Japan was capable of doing that. Small wonder that the Japanese considered American policy perverse, inconsistent, always restrictive. It could be argued that Japan made more of an effort to understand American needs than Americans did of Japanese needs. To the Japanese, man and nature are one. Life is a gift to be cherished. Man's highest goal is serenity, harmony with nature. Their beliefs evolved from the ancient Buddhist and later Shinto religions. Little is preferred to big, the intimate to the impressive, the simple to the complex, the natural to the artificial. The essence of life is pride in self, land, and nation. Fulfillment of national pride propelled Japan to tragic conflict. For the first time in history, civilians became targets of massive bombing attacks. The ruthless Japanese attack on Shanghai climaxed the invasion of Manchuria. The onslaught was a cruel twist of policy undertaken to punish the Chinese for boycotting Japanese goods. The Manchurian-Shanghai crisis was a culmination of events that had been simmering for years. From the time of Genghis Khan, Japan had repelled all invaders and shunned contact with the outside world. Her people led a peaceful, isolated existence, and Japanese culture flourished pure and untouched by the West until the summer of 1853. After several futile attempts, the United States penetrated the wall of isolation. An intimidating squadron of 4 heavily armed ships anchored at the mouth of Tokyo Bay. They were under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. Commodore Perry's black ships and his well-armed sailors presented a formidable threat. The Japanese were impressed by Perry's firmness, dignity, and tact, and also by his weapons. In Japanese eyes, the Western intruders were barbarians. Reluctantly, Japan later agreed to open 2 small ports to American ships for provision and trade. It was not much, but the door was open. American power again impressed Japan when Commodore George Dewey in 1898 destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. The Spanish-American War provided the excuse for the United States to seize the Philippines and annex Hawaii and Guam. For generations to come, the Japanese would resent America's Far Eastern designs. To further impress the Japanese, in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet to Japan. Part of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy was to convince Japan that America was determined to play a major role in the Pacific. For many reasons, American presence in the Far East had always seemed a threat to the Japanese. The acquisition of Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, and coaling stations at Pago Pago and Wake Island, all this strengthened their conviction that the United States was a force to be feared. Gradually, Japan, an island empire with a growing population, began to see America as a roadblock to legitimate Japanese expansion. Japan's desire for empire was not different in her eyes from the imperialism of Europe and the United States in the 19th century. The only difference was that Japan started later. In 1905, Japan suddenly came of age as a world power. The Japanese felt threatened by new imperialism, this time from Tsarist Russia in Manchuria. The emperor ordered the Japanese army to stop Russian expansion. The Russians were confident no European power had ever been defeated by an Asian country. In the bloody battle for Port Arthur, the Japanese pounded the Russians with huge German cannon called Osaka babies. Shock waves of Japanese soldiers assaulted the Russian stronghold overlooking the bay. The attack overwhelmed the Russian army. The battlefield became a graveyard. The Japanese also paid a high price. The war claimed 100,000 Japanese lives. The Russians surrendered on New Year's Day, 1905. Japan had annihilated the Russian Navy and had defeated one of the world's major military powers. And that victory was a clear announcement that Japan had mastered Western technology. The Russo-Japanese War left in its wake a strong, arrogant military establishment. Japan had a new set of national heroes and an enormous sense of national pride. A conference at Portsmouth, New Hampshire ended the war. The Japanese asked President Theodore Roosevelt to negotiate the peace. To protect American interests in the Far East, he sought a balance of power between Japan and Russia. Roosevelt's manipulation of the conference produced in Japanese eyes a diplomatic defeat and underscored their feeling of racial inferiority.
Ever since Perry had arrived in Japan, a fundamental stated objective of every governmental leader of Japan was to achieve, of course, recognition of equality with the Western powers, and particularly with the United States. So the principle of racial equality to the Japanese meant, the ultimate culmination of their national policy from certainly 1868.
The Japanese suffered another humiliating defeat on the issue of immigration into the United States. The first Oriental influx into America was Chinese labor. In California, American labor turned against the Chinese and closed off immigration. Soon the Japanese began to take their place, and prejudice against the Japanese also became intense. In 1907, the Japanese government solved the problem by restricting immigration to the United States. This so-called gentleman's agreement, however, did not change the attitudes.
I detected a great sense of racism in our attitudes, having been raised in Japan and therefore knowing them much more intimately than most people did. I myself resented American racist attitude because we'd shown that in many ways all along.
Through adversity, relations improved after the devastating Tokyo earthquake of 1923. American aid to rebuild Tokyo may have been a mixed blessing. As the demolished city began to rise from the ashes, Tokyo became westernized. Western-style architecture, which overpowered traditional Japanese design, would soon dominate the business district. There would be large department stores, movie theaters, coffee shops. A new urban lifestyle would emerge. While this appealed to many middle-class Japanese, others felt Japan was losing her soul.
The Japanese faced a tremendous problem of catching up technologically with the West. And this meant a great adoption of Western technology and institutions and so on, which amounted to a certain amount of Westernization, and bothered them very much. They worried that maybe they were losing their essence as being Japanese.
America's national pastime, baseball, became Japan's favorite sport. Beiseburu, as they pronounce it. Babe Ruth was as much a hero in Japan as in Yankee Stadium. And Ty Cobb shared his secrets with the Japanese. Western influence could be seen everywhere. Even the royal princesses shunned the traditional kimono for Western clothes. It seemed to be a smooth blending of East and West, but the honeymoon was short. In 1924, Congress dropped the curtain on Japanese-American friendship by passing a law excluding all Japanese by reason of race from immigration into the United States.
The legislative act certainly was a very bitter blow to the Japanese government, and rightly so. And naturally, in the Japanese press, the Discrimination Act, the Exclusion Act, was regarded as an event of unpardonable, unforgivable humiliation, and with it, of course, confirmations that particularly the Americans and the American society was just rampant with hypocrisy, preaching all sorts of Christian virtues to the Chinese and Japanese, and practicing all sorts of unchristian virtues against Japanese and Chinese.
In response, Japan proclaimed a day of national mourning. At mass rallies, the Japanese protested the Exclusion Act and what they called American white imperialism. The new anti-immigration law was a national insult and left no room for face-saving. There was continuous tension in the 1920s between the traditionalists and progressives. In 1924, following the Immigration Act that cut off Japanese immigration in the United States, the pendulum swung to the traditionalists. America's restrictive immigration policy was a racist slap in the face that humiliated the Japanese, and it provided their justification for the new Asian order, for anti-Americanism, and for a return to traditional Japanese culture. Traditionalism inevitably led to militarism and glorification of the samurai heritage. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes was prophetic when he said, "It is a dangerous thing to plant a deep feeling of resentment in the Japanese people. I dislike to think what the reaping will be after the sowing of this seed." In 1926, Crown Prince Hirohito became Emperor of Japan.
Well, he was a man who grew up, in a sense, in the 1920s, and I think shared in the liberalism of that time, when he was even allowed to go out of Japan and ostensibly studied Oxford for a few months and so on. And all the acts that we know that he took show him as being rather appalled by the rise of militarism and the movement away from parliamentary rule. There are several incidents in which he did say something, but the Japanese for 1,000 years and more had been accustomed to emperors that reigned but did not rule. This is an old idea in Japan. And even though they had in their constitution said all powers were in the hands of the emperor, nobody meant that at all. They didn't expect the emperor to exercise it. It was going to be the men around the emperor who exercised those powers for him.
Militarists had finally found their moment and their method. The Constitution made it clear that the supreme command of the armed services was in the hands of the emperor, not the civilian government. With the young emperor as a figurehead, the military became more and more independent and gradually assumed control of foreign policy. As the Japanese grew more egocentric, the conflict between East and West became more pronounced. The rallying cry in Japan played on an old fear, Western imperialism. It was hard for Americans to understand how a nation so attached to the past could be a threat in the present.
There is a tendency on part of Americans as well as other Western observers to view Japan as either very thoroughly westernized or still being very traditional. And yet the truth, I think, is a combination of the two. And it's this which baffles foreign observers even today. And I think it's not surprising that at that time too.
The amalgam of Japanese energy and Western technology produced a naval building program that alarmed the West. To guarantee national security, the Japanese Navy demanded a ratio of 7 Japanese ships to every 10 American ships. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 left them short of that goal, but called for another conference in London in 1930. The Japanese intended to increase their strength at the London Naval Conference. The American delegation, which sailed under George Washington, was headed by Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson. Stimson was a man of the old school, well-bred, well-educated at Andover and Yale. He had a lawyer's sense of order and was an internationalist. He was also firm and believed in standing up to the Japanese. Stimson was determined to force the Japanese to accept the lower naval ratio. The delegates were friendly and cheerful as British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald opened the conference.
The group of my friends here are representative of the 5 great naval powers, and we have met for the purpose of coming to an agreement which will do 2 things, we hope. First of all, put an end to competition in naval armaments, and then effect reductions in programs.
Japan demanded an upward revision of her capital ship ratio, which had been set at 3 Japanese battleships for every 5 American or British battleships. The United States refused and was backed by Britain.
When they tried to extend that 5-5-3 ratio and put it to lesser ships than the capital ships, it was only applied to the battleships at first, to the heavy cruisers. In 1930, the climate had so changed that there was violent opposition. The Navy dug in its feet and fought bitterly. And the civilian government managed finally to force it down the throats of the Navy, but with great general opposition. And this was a sign that times had changed. The Japanese were feeling much less secure than they had in 1921-22.
When he returned to the United States, Secretary of State Stimson was a hero. He considered the London Naval Conference a great victory. In spite of the enthusiastic welcome, American naval officers were not happy with the treaty. They wanted to outbuild the Japanese Navy. President Hoover was too occupied with the Depression to care one way or the other. In Japan, the reaction was violent. Military officers like Colonel Tojo, the future Prime Minister, accused the government of compromising national security. They attacked what they called the spineless diplomacy of civilian leaders. Prime Minister Hamaguchi was assassinated, and the military took over foreign policy. For months, tension had been building up between the Japanese in Manchuria and Chinese nationalists under the command of Chiang Kai-shek. Japanese generals decided to invade Manchuria and create an incident which they blamed on the Chinese. Japan claimed the nationalists threatened her interests in Manchuria, which were considerable, extensive holdings and investments in vital raw materials. In addition, the army saw Manchuria as a buffer against Russian power in the north. The invasion met little resistance. Chiang Kai-shek did not want to sacrifice his nationalist army, so Chinese civilians died. By January 2nd, 1932, Japan was in complete control of Manchuria. The League of Nations finally sent an inspection team, the Lytton Commission, to Manchuria. It condemned Japanese aggression and the senseless killing of civilians, and also called for an autonomous Manchuria. Japan rejected the findings and later resigned from the League of Nations. Japanese aggression on the Asian mainland was just beginning. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria was the first challenge to the system of collective security that emerged after the First World War. The entire world, immobilized by depression, failed to meet the challenge, setting the stage for the policy of appeasement that hastened the rise of dictators and militarists and encouraged aggression. It was the crucial year 1933. A new president took office in America and a dictator in Germany. The League of Nations failed. Kellogg-Briand Pact to outlaw war proved a worthless piece of paper. The Washington Naval Treaty, which guaranteed the territorial integrity of China, proved meaningless. And all the diplomatic efforts of the past decade to assure peace and stability collapsed. The Depression had so paralyzed American foreign policy that the nation tried to isolate itself, retreating behind walls of neutrality, clinging to the belief that the moral force of public opinion would guarantee peace. Japan had every reason to believe that her Asian adventures would go unopposed.